So your paper was due this morning. I've not actually checked that you all turned it in. I was hoping to, but I had a bunch of meetings show up. So your next assignment will be peer review. So by late tonight, early tomorrow morning, I will have each assigned you two other people's papers to read and give feedback on. Okay, and I will talk a little bit more about feedback. You're gonna have 2 weeks to do that feedback. I originally was gonna only do it for 1 week, and then I realized this is really far from each of your space areas, right? So I will stop talking about program evaluation, and I will talk about reviewing now, just because that was on my schedule, and for some reason, I did not do that. So we're just gonna pop out of this. So as I'm opening up another slide, we'll find that. So your assignment is to do the review of those papers, and I'm going to go through what that's going to look like. It is written. For those of you for whom writing is difficult, if you also want to give auditory feedback, meet with a person, I'm perfectly fine with that. But I'm going to be grading your reviewing based on what's written. So if you're going to say you're going to have a conversation, let me know, because I might want to talk to you a little bit more, because you can't just have nothing written. Right? I'm going to grade you as a written review, almost as though you were doing a conference or journal review. But what I'm going to ask you to do in this process is not the same as a conference or journal review, because we're following our own process. So it's related to, but not the same. So let's talk about reviewing and what I expect you to get out of this. Okay, so this is, in fact, I call this one reviewing and giving feedback. And this is a combination of peer feedback and conference journal review. Right? So you might be doing this internally, you might be doing it for part of a conference. The feedback part is similar, but in this case, you're going to use our own process and give feedback at a process level. So the 6 steps to effective peer feedback are actually not that different than our 6 steps of reading, our reading processes. So the first step is going to be skim it, make a few notes. And this is literally notes about skimming, right? Because that's an important part of what you want to give people back. Then you're going to read it creatively and critically. And again, you're going to read it, you're going to give feedback on each of the critical and creative reads. You're going to summarize, and then the final part is the write-up of the review. Now, the critical and creative read, you took lots of notes, you had questions, that's the standard part. But then you're going to go back and you're going to produce a summary, compliments, suggestions, and corrections. And we'll come back to all those in great detail. So your skim. So you're going to do your classic 3 to 5 minute skim, make notes of what you think is the core of the paper, the highest level issues, and what made, if anything, you want to continue. Now in this class, you will continue. But if your answer is, I would not have continued reading this paper, you want to put that down as a feedback. You should try and find at least 2 positive things to say. People will more likely take your criticisms if you also give them some positive things. But note any questions you had at this stage. And then you're really going to be written notes. You can also mark up on paper. I forgot, I will accept that. So if you mark stuff on the PDF version of the paper and you mark it up, that's a good way of giving feedback. If your handwriting is legible, you can write. If you're like me, you can't. I can circle stuff and type, but you will read my handwriting. The one thing I'm going to recommend is if you're going to do, because we have multiple stages here, you either have multiple PDFs for each stage, or you mark them up with different colors in each stage, so that people can understand this was a comment I got during a scan, this is a comment I got during a critical read, this is a comment I got during a creative read. Not hard to change colors, so it should be pretty straightforward to do this. So, but at this point, you should have a set of notes. Here's what I got out of the scan. Here's what I didn't get out of the scan. Are they right or wrong? You don't know yet, but just take those notes, put them in there. That's the first thing you're giving back to the person. Because if you can't get out of the scan what they wanted, then it's a failure of communication at the scan level. And this is what, by the way, no journal or conference will ever ask you to do this. They only ask for the final review, not for what did you decide in 5 or 10 minutes. Now, every reviewer I know has already reached part of their conclusion in that 5 to 10 minutes, but they're going to go through the rest of the process and combine them all together and not say, here's what I got out of the 5-minute review. So now you're going to do your critical read. My recommendation is 30 minutes for this part of the assignment for the reading of it. Some of you might take an hour or 2 for a real review of novel work if you're really trying to understand it, whatever. For this assignment, I don't want you to necessarily understand everything. The other is, so 2 of the papers are researched, the rest are surveys. Surveys, it's not that hard to get, you don't have to get as deep, but understanding some research is a little bit deeper. So you don't actually have to answer the question, is it truly novel? If you're reviewing for a conference or journal, that's a really important part of the question, which almost always means going to the literature and looking at other papers besides this one answer, is what they did versus that paper really novel? Do not have to answer that question for this class. That's why it's going to take 30 minutes instead of an hour or two, because you're not analyzing and compared to a bunch of other papers. Again, you can do paper, PDF, whatever. If you do paper, you can scan it, so there's lots of ways of getting it in. You don't have to describe the issues in great detail, but you're eventually going to have to summarize them, right? So it's perfectly fine if you've just highlighted a bunch of things and then later on you say, between equations 3 and 5, I couldn't figure out how you got here, right? You're going to have some level of description of them. Note questions that need to be answered. So if there's a question that's like, I didn't understand this at all, that's a question, right? But it's more a comment, it's not a question. It's like, but if the question is like, how do you divide by this to reach that, right? That's a very particular question, and that's very good. Your job, especially at this level, is not proofreading, but you can mark up and note whatever you want, but you want to balance your time, right? So if you're marking up a lot of grammar, this is a classic problem. If there's so many grammar problems, you miss the big picture. One of the reasons I want you to do the scan and the other stuff first. There's no point about telling about fixing grammar if the entire section needs to be rewritten. You can say there were a lot of grammar issues, but I'm not going to mark them all up. But your important part during the critical read is the critical read of the content and the story and the science, not the critical read of the grammar. For some people, that's hard. I don't understand that, but I can skip all of it. But if it bothers you, then my recommendation is, if you're bothered by the grammatical things, right, take the time to note the grammar stuff and then read it again, trying to ignore it because you've already marked them all up. There might be a lot of writing. The second part is the creative read, right? Find the core story you think that works. This is a slightly different creative read than just how you will use it. If you think part of their story works and would be useful to you, tell them that, right? I can see, because if you see how you could use it and they don't talk about it in their paper, that is actually something that might change their paper that lets them realize how the audience is going to see it. And that could actually help them. Even if you would never use it, but you say, I liked how this part of the story works, maybe you could expand it or connect it. That is also good for them. Find multiple positive things to say. I struggle with this whenever I'm a reviewer. I'm really hard. Usually it involves creative reading and processing ideas and finding ways to do it. And this turned out to be an easy way. Even if the paper is really, really bad, you can see one of their ideas and say, well, there might be something to this idea if you could show this, this, and this, and this, right? So you've given them some positive feedback. You like the idea. So one of the reviews I was finishing up this morning, right? It's like, I really like parts of the idea in this paper, right? And I described then those couple of parts. It's like, unfortunately, the theory doesn't actually follow from the equations. Like, then I have like pages of problems, right? I always try to show something positive, because if the reviewer is ever going to follow up on this work and listen to my criticisms, they have to think there's some value in it. Right? There are times when I say, like, I see no value in this paper. I can't see it ever being published. Those do not go over well, but sometimes it's also, I want to put people out of their misery. But in this class, please no putting people out of their misery. You have to try and find some ways to make it better. But remember when you're doing this, that you're only one reader with one point of view. However, don't dismiss your one point of view. Don't say, I'm not an expert in this, but I think this, right? That reduces the value of your comment, right? Whether or not you're an expert, right? If the paper was written for an expert, right, then they've now completely dismissed it. But even if it's not written for an expert, when you say I'm not an expert, most people don't think, well, right? You're basically saying, please ignore my comment, here it is. So everyone in this class knows none of us are experts in what's going on, so don't worry too much about that kind of comment. Summarize. Generate a 3 to 4 sentence summary about what you think the paper is about. Okay, do not just cut and paste the first couple sentences out of the abstract. This drives me nuts when I see it as an area chair, where right, you can use your notes, but don't directly copy from the paper. The whole point is, what did you think the paper was about? Not what does the paper say the paper's about. Because there's plenty of papers whose abstracts say it's about this, and it really isn't. What's in the paper just never got there. They wrote the abstract first and it never followed up. If the scan and detailed reads are very different, so if your scan suggested one thing and your detailed reads actually found something completely different, put a couple of sentences in there that might have led to the confusion, right? I thought this paper was about this, but this made me see it was about that, and therefore it was disconnected, right? Because you're really helping them understand their story. Okay, so now all of this is, except for the scan part, this is true for reviewing for lots of things. The next steps are absolutely true for everybody, both in and outside of class. So the first rule of feedback is to be positive and constructive. Remember, this is about helping them. Think about how you would like to have somebody tell you something. One important thing that I recommend is never use personal pronouns. It is not you didn't do this. It is not even the authors didn't do this. My recommendation is the paper doesn't address this, whatever, right? You want to make it impersonal, even, so anything that's negative, you want to make it impersonal. The positive things, I guess I get this back. The positive things can be personal. You did a good job on this. The papers, the authors cover this well, right? Positive things can be personal. Negative things should be impersonal because they're more likely to feel good about it when you tell them it's about them and feel bad about it if you tell us about them. You want to make them feel about the work. Tell them what you did well. The significant part was this. I really loved your story because of this. You use lots of supporting details for this, right? This is one I end up using frequently. Why? Because it's true. They use lots of supporting details for this, right? They may have failed over here, they may have failed over here, but somewhere they hopefully use supporting details or supporting examples or whatever, right? I like the fact that you tried to formalize this, even when the formalization fails, right? You find some positive things to stick in there. That part's pretty straightforward. The next parts are about the suggestions. Make suggestions giving the author some specific details how to make his or her writing / paper / science better, right? Stay positive and be specific. So instead of, which I said earlier, it doesn't make sense, say, if you added more details after this sentence, it might be clearer. Now, there are times when you can't really tell them, but this whole section needs to be cleared up. This is a positive statement as opposed to, I couldn't understand it. I do have phrases like, it doesn't make sense, or I couldn't understand this, especially when I'm reviewing outside my core area, when I'm more likely to think maybe somebody else did understand and I didn't, right? It's like saying it didn't make sense to me, maybe you could clear this up, right? So it's not just saying it doesn't make sense. You got to follow up with what makes it better. If you're just writing comments, clearly specify where is the issue, page, paragraph, column number. So page 3, halfway down the page, something so they know what you're talking about. It may be perfectly clear to you because you're looking at the paper. When you get these reviews and you're now trying to say, what are they talking about? Because especially if you try to give context by saying what they were talking about, they might have talked about it in 2 or 3 places. Now it's very confusing. I like to, line 7, so our review papers almost always have line numbers on the edges or in the middle, but if not, column 2, page 6, halfway down the page, about an inch under equation 8, something that gives them a visual reference of where things go. That will really help them, because if they can't figure out where it's going to go, they're just not going to bother to fix it. Some ways you can make suggestions. Perhaps using blank would have helped the reader, blank, whatever, some combination of things. I didn't understand the sentence paragraph at line 75. I found your argument about whatever confusing, weak, whatever. And even though I have suggestions in here, this is a place where it's good to mix in some positive ones, right? I found this good, but is another way of getting the critique in there. Yes, good point. Good correction, right? I didn't. This is. Thank you for the correction. A statement is wrong, so a citation might help. So this one is one where if you're going to say a citation might help, I actually strongly recommend, and in my field we almost require, that you provide the citation. Right? If you say, this is well known, so-and-so did this, right? You'd be surprised how many papers Hinton is published. You can't just say Hinton published this, right? It's like, tell me which one, in which year, because it's all over the place. But even if the name is very unique, right? That Bolt published this. I don't have that many papers. Tell them the actual reference. Otherwise, you're basically running the risk that the meta reviewers, the area chairs, whatever, will look at your review and say, well, I actually can't verify that your review is correct. I'm not going to take the time to go figure out which paper you meant, right? But when I'm doing the meta review, which is common in our field, or the associate editors at the next level up, right? The associate editor or meta reviewer wants to check your review. If you say this has already been done in some paper, and I'm an editor, I go check that your paper you cited says something that's related. Because there's nothing worse as a reviewer than getting a paper review that says, this work has already been done by so-and-so, and you read that paper, and it's like, that paper has nothing to do with what my paper is, right? There's a disconnect here, right? Our job as meta reviewers, area chairs, editors, right, is to make sure the reviews are correct. So you have to give this not just to the author, but also to the meta reviewer. And that's in your own personal best interest because the meta reviewer knows who you are. The authors don't. You may think, I don't care, they'll never find out who I am. The meta reviewers do. You want to be known as somebody who does good reviews by those people because they're going to respect you a little bit better. So fill that in. Third step is for peer feedback is making corrections, making suggestions of the paper, spelling, grammar, mispunctuations, incomplete or run-on sentences. Whenever I'm reviewing a good enough paper, I always do this. When I'm reading a bad paper, maybe not. It depends on how bad the paper is, because again, there's no sense in fixing spelling and grammar mistakes in sections that have to be completely rewritten because it's just not there. For this class, if you notice them, please do. Again, your job is not to proofread. My job is not to proofread, but I take off points for bad grammar. So you'll have to get them fixed somehow. Any questions on this? Right? So this is pretty much what I expect out of your assignment is going to be marked up versions of the papers or notes from the different reads with suggestions and corrections. The suggestions and corrections, by the way, they're always textual notes. Right? Even if you marked up the rest of the paper, the other stuff, you're going to put your corrections on. Any questions? So because I'm asking you to do this and you haven't done it right, I'm going to give you 2 weeks to do this. I'm actually going to ask for next week's journal to talk about what your process is, how well it worked for you, and what worked and what didn't, what you're struggling with, right? But if not, then we'll just be doing 2 weeks. Okay, next section. So I'm now going to talk a little bit about some of the differences for journals and conferences. So standard reviews items, right? So title of the author, summary of the paper and the contributions, positive things about the paper, weaknesses, and then private comments to the PC, AC, or editor. So these are pretty much almost every place I look at. These are things you're going to ask about. Not everyone asks about positive weaknesses. I'm going to put them together in a few other ways. We'll see some examples. But in my view, it's always the positive and the weaknesses. Even if they don't tell them to organize them that way, you should be saying, here's the positive things, here's the weaknesses to put together. So when you're reviewing it, right, read the paper, think about it, ideally some gap, and then you write the review. So it's, my view, bad form to read the paper, write the review, and in an hour I'm done. Unfortunately, that is very common, but my recommendation is I like to read the papers, or in my case, listen to the papers, and look at them a little bit. Give it about a week or two, and then I go to write the reviews. Because it gives me a chance to think about things in context, but also to think about things over a period of time, not just have my gut reaction to the paper. So I might take some notes while I'm reading the paper and have, here's my gut reactions. Right? Also so that I don't forget, because a week later it's like, what was that? I don't want to reread the paper in detail, so I'm going to go through it in balance. Right? And then have that gap and then write the reviews. So in between, I might take a look at the related work, leave it alone for a few more days. How is this different? What's going on? And then read it again and write the review. So that process is, in that gap, I might look at a bunch of other papers, decide what's going on. I'm not really looking at that paper anymore. I'm now looking at the related work and trying to figure out how to do that. So when I talk about thinking about it, what's the paper trying to do? What's the observation? What's the motivation? It's unfortunate when papers are motivated by X and then their experiments or their theory has nothing to do with that. Right? This disconnect is something you want to talk about. Programs often do X in the future, Y won't work, right? So these are kinds of observations or motivations that they're trying to do. And then one of your jobs is to connect, is that related to what the paper actually concludes? The goal of the paper, when you get done your Oscar, is you start big, it's okay, it's very broad, you get something, but have to be able to relate it back. And some papers fail to do that. The implementation, here's how to explore this observation or whatever's going to go on, and then the evaluation. By the time you're done this class, you've already seen a little bit of evaluation. We'll do more next week, and we'll talk about statistics, right? You can really place, even if I don't understand a field, I can still comment on, were the experiments done well? Is the paper's experimentation related to the observation? I may not be able to answer how novel is this, but I can say, did they follow a good process in almost any scientific field? Right? The only problem I have is like if they use synonyms that I can't match up, then I'm stuck, right? But other than that, you can get through a lot of this stuff. So did you gain an important insight from a contribution point of view? Was there a new problem, a new way to look at the problem, a counterintuitive or unexpected result? Any of these are significant positive things about the paper. The counterintuitive or unexpected result might not seem important, but it is. Because if it's counterintuitive to you, it might be counterintuitive to lots of people. And when people's intuition is wrong, they're not doing research in the right way. So you want to fix that. Did it propose a good solution to a problem that's sort of out there? The explanation should explain why it works and why it's a better solution. The latter part is often what's lacking. They don't show why it's a better solution. Did they have a good quantitative evaluation? So new insights, a new problem may not have as good a quantitative evaluation, But if they're trying to say, is it better than somebody else, then they have to have a good enough evaluation. Should it work in real processes? Should it gain or lose relevance in the future? Should it work in real applications? It is perfectly common, it's perfectly acceptable and unfortunately common for papers to be rejected because this is a completely academic problem. Right? This doesn't exist in the real world. I don't think you have to pick on security, right? This is where you see it. I see a lot of it in AI, in machine learning, right? Like this problem has nothing to do with the real world. Right?
I assume the attacker has full access to the algorithm, including all inputs and outputs and all internal states. Okay, that's a great assumption. I don't see the attacker actually having that.
Oh, that depends on if it's an insider attacker or not, right?
Fair.
But then you have to phrase it properly. Right? It's like where it's like right, yes. Well, it depends. Yeah, if they become root, then they can have all kinds. So there's a whole range of things, right? But if my problem is like, how do I stop this other problem? And the big hole is like buffer overflows, then my problem may not be relevant, right? So the academic problem may be assume the attacker has somehow got all this access, and now my problem is, well, how do I limit what they can do to the database? Well, I'm sorry. If they already can be root, then the security of my code doesn't matter, right? So there's a
or like I have physical access to the hardware. I can do all these side channels. Well, you have physical access to the hardware, so like, of course you can do all these side channels.
Yeah. So, and there's bounds, but every field of computer science has that issue where there are applications where it doesn't really work in the real world. It's just like such an abstraction. On the other hand, abstractions are an important part of computer science, so there's not instantly wrong because of that, right? But if it's also something that's becoming less and less relevant, like here's how I can improve the speed of T9 typing recognition. You remember T9? You're not old enough, right? T9 is back when you only had the 10-digit buttons on your phone, and you would text by saying, "Oh look, I want a T." That's hit the 8 key 3 times, right?
No, it was predictive. So as you type the more keys,
Well, no, I was saying, but so I said, like T9 was how it predicted what the most likely next characters would be, right? But you go to the next word, or right? But yes, I could try and make that faster. You know what? There's still a lot of people using T9. If I want to talk about improving, data access in Africa, might still be a problem, right? But you know what? In 5 or 10 years, it's not going to be a problem there anymore either, right? So yes, you may have done something and shown it's better, but it doesn't answer the who cares test, or it won't in 5 years, right? So all of those are kinds of things you're looking at what's going to happen in the paper. So your summary is a little bit like the paper abstract, right? Is it short, self-contained, no undefined acronyms, short, high-level description? Do not just copy it from their abstract, right? And in this point, when I'm doing the summary, it's hard, but it's important that you're not judgmental here. This is a statement about what the paper is, not about how the paper is flawed or what's going on. It is just a summary of the paper. But it's perfectly fine without their sales pitch, right? So they might say this paper, shows it's better, right? Your summary might say their paper does a comparison against, right? A statement of fact, not that it's better or worse, it's just a comparison against. And it's perfectly fine, without being too positive or too negative, to say what you feel is really the contribution. This paper shows some interesting insights. That's okay, right? Whether or not they said that or not, if you feel that was actually what's happening, that's okay. But don't feel you want to include what they say if you disagree with it. But don't disagree with them in the summary. The positive contributions are good points. If you learn something, that's good. If it can be used in real systems, that's good, right? Those are always things you should point out. List the most important things. If you only list well-written, the paper is probably really bad. Okay, so, but if you can't even rest that, then it's really, really bad. But but it's okay to talk about how well the paper is written. You like the figures, right? Whatever. You can talk about it, whatever. There are always some good points. Find them. It's hard, but that's an important part of being a reviewer. It might only be 1 or 2 positive things and then like 4 pages of negatives. There's an imbalance question, but you'll get to that. The weaknesses or the bad points. My recommendation is you break them down into 2 categories, major and minor. Not all review systems will let you have major and minor, but even if they don't, my recommendation is you list the major ones first and then the minor ones. Because if people go through them in in document order, which is the way people often write them, you're literally making comments as you go through, right? My recommendation is you learn to have a note hand, either have a buffer where you can put major and minor, or put a note like a little m and a big M so you can keep track of which are which, so then later on you can sort them. Right? I do lots of them in order as I'm listening to the paper, but then I reorder them. So motivational problems, it's unclear whether there is a problem. More commonly, it's unclear why it's an important problem. Right? Multiple papers will say, like, we're solving the same problem this person did. Well, that didn't show me that's an interesting problem. Right? Unless that paper was in a way better venue that I'm going to just trust, I want to know what's the real motivation for the problem. Implementation problems, unclear why they solve the problem, unclear what the trade-offs are, unclear what the implementation is. There's plenty of papers where you cannot figure out how you could ever implement this because they simply lack the details. Evaluation problems, right? There's all kinds of things we've talked about with these in terms of experimentation. We'll talk a lot more about when we get to statistics. Organizational problems, is it difficult to follow? Does it not actually make sense in the order things are presented? List the most important bad points first, right? If difficult to read is the only problem, it's actually a great paper, right? So it's probably not starting with, like, this paper was hard to read. That's a minor problem unless there's something else really wrong with the paper. Then if that's it, you're good. Questions to answers. First of all, some places there is no point in the process for them to actually answer your question. In which case, I mix the question just in with the bad, right, where it's going on. But I still like to formulate them as questions because it gives the reader, the next time I revise this paper, I have to help answer this question because it was a question, right, as opposed to a statement of fact. So instead of saying, like, this section was not understandable, it's like, can you explain how this happens in this section? Right? It makes it much more precise in where it's going to go. For conferences that do, and lots of the conferences, journals which you may review, will eventually have a rebuttal process. Right? It's important that you separate questions that can be answered in a few days versus questions that will take another year or 6 months to answer, or 4 months or whatever. And in journals, right, this is the difference between a minor revision, which is just go fix some presentational stuff and run to experiments. If you run an experiment a day, you can still make it a minor revision. It's going to take you 6 months of effort. That's a major amount of work. We want to get it done. So if you're unsure if you got something right, especially if the decision depends on it, right, make sure that your understanding is correct, right? Do ask for that here, right? So if you think, I'm struggling with an understanding of equation 7, right? That determines whether or not I find the paper acceptable or not. Tell the reviewers that. Why? Because they're going to get comments general from 3 reviewers, maybe 4, and they got to prioritize what to answer. So if the answer of that question to you is really important, tell them, because otherwise they may not answer your question, which leaves you still unable to draw a conclusion about the paper. And then the last section of major, minor, or general comments, right? Help the author improve the paper, be constructive. Even if the paper is hopeless, right? The problem of a conflict in a set of subjects is not very important. The author should focus on lower associative caches, right? Whatever your view is, right? If here's what it's going to take to make this paper better, tell them it's constructive, even if there's no way to solve that problem in this paper, because this paper is all about the 1024-way cache. Right? There's no revision of this paper that's going to make it work, but you're telling them about their future research. So don't view it as just a paper. View it as a research career for them. Help them. All grammatical, writing, organization stuff issues go here. If it's a reject, you can sort of stop after a few examples to show them the grammar is an issue, or you can take the time. Right? There's a balance. Right? I've had multiple times when my reviews are longer than the paper. Not as dense as the paper, but it's like, when you print mine out, they're like 7 or 8 pages long. And there's lots of things going on in a 6-page or 8-page paper, right? And that's actually because the paper is so good, I want to help them make it really good. Right? For a really bad paper, I'll stop after a page. It's like, okay, I've told you all the major things. I'm not going to fix any of the minor things. We'll get to it. Confidential comments. This is a place where you can put in some things where otherwise you would end up disclosing your identity, right? So my group did this in 1999, and it was published in ICSA for that year, right? So this is a tricky thing. You can say, this paper didn't compare against the work of Bolt et al. 1999, whatever, right? You can do that, and that's it's a good thing to do. You should put that in for the author, but the meta reviewer, the area chair, the editor, may or may not recognize that as you because you did a good job of writing it in the third person reference, right? So if you really want the editor to listen to you, it's like, we already did this, we know exactly what's going on, this is just completely flawed. This kind of comment lets them know, yes, I know exactly what's going on, what's in that work. Another common thing would be, this is a double, or is a double submission similar to paper XX at the conference YYY, right? Because you might see both of those. Or, I think this paper is plagiarizing ZZZZ. These last two comments should never go to the authors, even if you believe they're true, because you can't verify it, the author can't argue about it, right? You want to let the editors deal with that. So that's the kind of comment. There's plenty of other things you can put in there. It's like, I wasn't really confident in this, I struggled with math. Another common one I see when I'm an editor is, I skimmed over the math, right? It's good to tell them that, if that's what you really did, be honest about it, right? Like, I couldn't understand the math, right? All of that helps them make a decision, because if there's multiple reviewers, and one said, I read the math and it's wrong, and you don't say anything, then they don't know if you thought the math was right. But if you say, I skimmed over the math, and this guy said the math is wrong, then they're just going to say the math is wrong. You skimmed over it. Scoring systems, probably this. If they have them, they sort of are there to compare other papers in the same journal conference class. So compare to other papers in this class, right? So they might have a category, common categories, things like weak accept, strong accept, neutral, weak accept, strong reject. Other journals or conferences will have 10 categories, right? They will generally give you similar in quality to the lower halves of accepted papers, which is the top 20% of all papers, right? So they'll have some descriptions. So one of the things if you're reviewing is put that in context. You'll look through that. It's also important when you're reading your reviews, you know what these words mean, because they actually try and live to that. And I would say about half the reviewers have any idea what those phrases are for their own conference. There's strong accept. They know what that means, right? But is it 5% or top 10% of the submissions, right? Or is it top 5%? That's going to vary a lot. So there's a lot of scoring stuff that goes on. Once you get to be more experienced, right, these numbers will mean things, right? So you can read through those when you're making a recommendation. The one problem I have, because I'm with my dyslexia, is that I will often get these exactly backwards. Every now and then there's a conference. Well, if they actually use phrases like weak accept, right, I never get that backwards because I know what the word accept means, right? But if they say top 1% regular, sometimes I get directions mixed up and get them wrong. Most of the time you can tell from the comments if somebody's that far off. So when you're reviewing, always focus on the big picture. Don't focus on minor issues. Very easy to find lots of these. So if you're a junior reviewer and you want to fill in your review, you can go find a bunch of those, right? Just make sure your review looks long enough. But really focus on the make or break issues. If X wasn't here, it would be a much worse paper. Then X is an important positive thing, right? If X was done right, it would be a much better paper. X is a very negative thing, right? Find some of those. And that's another place to find some of those positive things, right? They did a really good job of this because the math was right? Whatever you want to say. Consider the space, right? Don't ask for something if you think that you think they should have done, unless you can also say, this was missing and it's more important than this thing you had. Give them feedback, because otherwise you're struggling. Like, I got 8 pages. It's hard to figure everything to get it in, right? You're telling me what to do. And conversely, this is also why I will tell you, your paper should always be whatever the maximum allowed length is. Because if not, then reviewers really get to beat you up. It's like, you didn't talk about this and you had space. Right? As opposed to, you talked about this, it's more important than that. That's a harder decision than, like you just had nothing else to say. So if you're looking for example reviews, first ask your advisor. You probably want to read papers and reviews in your area, not mine. Your advisor probably has reviewed before. Your first foray into reviewing might be to ask your advisor. Lots of conferences and journals actually have a process by which the official reviewer, say that's me, can give it to my students. And then literally at the bottom of the review form, it says, this review completed by. They assign it to me, and then I assign it to one of my students. If I do it with my students, I do it jointly with them, and then I still file my review, and I go over my review with them so they learn. But you should try and get into reviewing as soon as possible. The more you review, the more you will understand how to write good papers. Right? So you might as well get some of that practice. If you're looking for a couple of places, this machine learning space, openreview.net has both reviews of accepted and rejected papers. And then NIPS or NERPS has reviews of accepted papers, not of the rejected papers. But you can get a sort of feel for what are some reviews by looking at those. And there's probably papers in other spaces. These are just the ones I knew off the top of my head. And at that, I'm just going to call that. Any questions about reviewing for either your assignment or just in general? I thought I had a whole bunch of review notes about like the journals. Okay. I actually have some forms of like, here's the questions they ask. Maybe I did it when we talked about writing.
Yeah,
I did. Okay.
that was presented before.
Yeah, okay, fine, yes. Those are reviewer questions, which also helps you as you're doing your writing.
I'll
Okay.
just make a comment about that open review site. It's really good, it's brilliant. I've used it sometimes when I'm trying to understand a paper that is on archive or one of these places where open reviews are possible. And sometimes by looking at the reviewer notes, I can understand the paper better.
Yeah, so one of the good things about open review is, right, you can see why this paper is still in archive after 3 years. So it's good to check, right? So I've actually been a antagonist for the open review group. I find lots of problems with it. So parts of it I like. And so like the NeurIPS thing, which was actually sort of a compromise, right? The ones that get published, I have no problem with the reviews for those. I have a different problem, which is actually because of my writing style, lots of people will know instantly it's me. Or it's like the same reviewer that we had last year. So there's a different problem with that. But my biggest concern is that open reviews comments, right, are not always correct. And there's
That's
no
true.
place for the author to argue
Challenge.
that this comment is correct. And so you'll find those papers, you'll find those comments, right? But those papers are often doomed to die now because they had negative reviews on open review. Very few papers that get rejected through open review ever show up anywhere. Why? Because the next review is going to look at that same review and sort of say, oh, look, it was rejected over here, right? I found it. I'm going to make the same argument, right? And so the authors now have to work very hard to overcome this negative bias that came out because open review published these things. And we had one of our papers, the only time we submitted it was on open review, and two of the reviewers were completely wrong. They had like, no idea what the paper, part of it was our fault, right, which is presentational. But once the idea gets in there that this whole idea is just garbage, right, it's very hard to overcome that because these people have trashed the idea when it was more a presentational issue. They misunderstood. We failed to communicate, between us. We didn't get them in the right place. And then it's 2 years later before you can get it published, if at all.
The same is true for conference anyway, that usually if you submit, there isn't a challenge process.
Actually, almost all the conferences I go to have a challenge
challenge.
process.
Okay.
The difference is, even if there's not a challenge process, right, no one else knows about those
It's secret,
conferences.
yeah.
Right? And then the last reason, which actually I do worry about, is that people who are out looking for a job or who have a job and are going up for tenure, if somebody is trying to make a case against you, right, they can go look up. It's like, look, here's a review, and quote, like, a review of your paper said this, right? This is, and some of the reviews are quite negative and aggressively negative, right? It's like, this is one of the stupidest ideas I've ever seen, right? You can imagine going out for a job interview and if somebody's like, so, we looked at your open review paper. You want to comment on this? And that's the company that bothered to interview you, right? You might just die because of this. And that's my other side, is that I struggle with is, right? We actually talked about in our community just having some examples of, here's some positive papers, here's some negative papers, right? Anonymize the paper, right? So you can sort of see. But as soon as people's careers are on the line, right? And there are various members of the community that are pretty aggressive about what their point of view is, right? So that can be difficult. But it's a good resource if you want to go look for examples. Okay, we'll call that a day. I will no, that's not what I wanted.